Hey, it's Jared from Coda. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief look into how I personally like to go about planning the content schema for Sanity based off of the Figma document that we have here. The first step is I like to go through and treat the design almost like you would pseudocode. I like to go through and box everything out just so it's nice and tidy and I can start reasoning about things both in terms of the front end architecture as well as the content model that we need to create for our content management system. And in this, we are going to be using Sanity, but this same process obviously applies everywhere. So this is just a nice, helpful way to get started. After you have everything blocked out, I like to go through one by one and just sort of make a list and plan out how things are going to be named, what data we need to accommodate for, what things can be hard-coded, what needs to be dynamic, so on and so forth. My guiding principle for these things is typically measure twice, cut once, right? It's a lot easier to decide in Figma that this should probably be a string than after we've already created the field and started working with it in our front end, and then we decide it's not quite as flexible as we needed it to be. So once we have that, I go one by one and start planning them out. So to start, I know that the header and the footer are going to be static on our front end. That's I guess only mostly true because these elements here we're going to be pulling from a global settings configuration. However, the architecture itself is going to just be, grabbing these URLs from a global thing. It's not necessarily something we need to build an object for in our content schema. The next one that we can move on to is the hero. So I like to, just as sort of a workflow, I go ahead and I give everything a name up front. You could either break them down one at a time and name them as you go, or you could go through and give them all names to start. I don't know why. For me, it just tends to make the most sense to go ahead and name everything up front, and it's just the way I like to work. From there, you can start breaking things down section by section, what pieces of content you need to incorporate. So for the hero, we just need a heading, and we need a subheading. The illustration will eventually need to be dynamic as well, but just to get started, since this is a landing page, there's only one real occurrence of this, so we don't really necessarily need to start handling those things just yet. The next thing that we can break down is this features section. So the obvious ones here, again, most sections are going to have some sort of a pattern with heading and subheading, something like that. But what's helpful about this is now we can see before we've even gotten into any code at all that we actually have some repeated patterns here. And so if we give this a nice little box to work with, we can see that we have a handful of repeated content types. And these all have different content, but they follow the same structure and pattern, and they all have the same pieces of data. So we can see here this is probably a good spot to find some sort of an abstraction. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we need an array for this whole box. So I can see that we need an array of features, and we will call this whole array the feature list, right? And then each of those features will be an abstracted object that we will code in Sanity. But all those need is a heading, and we're actually not going to call that subheading. We'll call that body. That seems more appropriate. And so this feature will just be an abstraction, I guess, for this feature list. And so that's, again, kind of the premise of why we like to break things down this way, is it just helps us see some of these things before time so that we don't have to end up repeating ourselves and tweaking things as we go and playing in the code. It's a lot easier to drag boxes in Figma than it is to erase content types, especially once you've begun content loading and things like that. It's a huge pain when you need to start renaming and reorganizing. Data gets lost, and it's just a big pain. So now that we have the features done, the next one here is going to be the social callout. Following pretty much the exact same pattern that we did above, we're going to need a heading, and then we are going to have an abstraction for these. And now, again, kind of similar to what I've said here at the beginning of the video, these social links themselves will be pulling from some sort of a global configuration. And so what I think I want to do is create maybe a global object where we can define the platform name and the description, as well as description. as well as the link associated with those. Now, that's not really so much a content thing, so I'm not going to label that here, but we'll just kind of keep in our back pocket that we want to create this sort of a global abstraction for these things. And so that means that if we have that defined globally, then what we need for this actual module is going to be an array of references to those modules, right? So if we have each one of these things defined in a list somewhere else, then we know that we can just create an array where we can select these and reorder them however we want to do that, depending on whatever we want to prioritize in our content. And so the next step that I like to work through is we've broken everything up. We've sort of reasoned through where everything needs to live in the content management system. We've kind of decided some names for things. The next thing that I like to do is then translate this into a more formalized list. I like to use Notion so that I can create an actual checklist to work through as I create all of these content types in Sanity. And then that also just allows me to make notes on things like for the hero, I need a string, and I need a string for the heading and subheading. And then I can begin thinking ahead in terms of an array of type feature for this feature list module. And then the object of feature will contain these things of these content types. And one thing that I didn't mention over in Figma is we need this tag. And so in here, that again, just taking this second step, I can see as I reason through it, I can say, okay, I have these things defined. Oh, forgot about this guy here. And so we'll have a tag, and this will be a list of tags that I have, that I have defined as a document. And so this is something that we can create a list of different tags that things can have. And then other places in our content will be able to access those tags in a pretty structured way on just about any object that we want to. And we can go ahead and define things like new, cool, hot, whatever it might be. And so that's, again, just a nice catch that you wouldn't have probably had until you were already working on the front end, and then you'd have to come back and work that thing in retroactively, and that just would have been kind of a pain. For the social callout, the string, and then the social list will be an array of references of the type social, and these will also be a document, kind of like these tags, so that as as Coda grows or things like that, I'm thinking we can probably add to the array of social platforms, eventually someday, maybe there's a Slack or a Discord or a Twitch, whatever it ends up being. We're able to just keep adding to that list, and then we can reference them in different modules however we want to, and pull in those data types in sort of a global way. And so this is my personal approach to breaking down a design and organizing what kind of content types need to be accommodated for and things like that. This might feel a little bit tedious for something this small, but you can imagine if this was a 25-page website, it would be really handy to start breaking down maybe repeated patterns and things, and maybe even second layers of abstractions that you could find for layouts and things like that. But I just want to start from the get-go doing all of this right the first time. It's because I really hate having to slow down and go back and fix things the second time around. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to start building this out in Sanity and sort of show you how I like to go from design to Notion, and then ultimately have a living, breathing content schema that we can start creating our pages with.